Session 0 can reduce player dropout, it can set expectations, and it can help you creating a better gaming experience for you and your players. Maybe you know this issue, you have prepared a lot of stuff for a campaign for your players, and your players show up, you play, and over the weeks the players are less motivated to show up for your games. In this situation, a Session 0 can help. You should have a Session 0 before you start your campaign, so you set the expectations for you and your players, but you can have a Session 0 at any point in the campaign. First, you want to know how experienced are your players. Are there some players that are veteran players that know exactly how to play, that have played several campaigns? Or are there players that have never played a role-playing game before? Depending on the experience that your players have, you may want to hold a one-shot for them, so they can figure out what the game is, how it works, and what they can choose to do within the game. Then your players want to know, is it a plot-driven game or is it a sandbox game? Is it driven only by the choices that the characters make, or is there a general larger plot that your players are part of? Then you need to talk about the schedule. Do you play weekly, monthly, twice a month, and how long does a session take? How long can your players stay focused and concentrated on the game? Do you always play on the same day in a rhythm? Because when you're in my age, most people don't have a lot of time, therefore we block one day every 2 weeks. Now when someone has something way more important to do than playing a role-playing game, and to be honest, there's nothing more important than a role-playing game, but if, then we try to find another day. As the thing that you try to do with the Session 0 is set expectations, let's talk about the most important things that you have to set expectations for. At first, you should ask your players what expectations do they have from the game and from you as the game master. Maybe their expectations are too high because they have watched Critical Role and want you to be like Matt Mercer, and you can't be, so you have to set the expectations a little bit down. You have to let them know if you use the 3 pillars of role-playing games, which is combat, investigation, and social encounters. You may ask your players which themes they want to have within the game. Themes are things like power corrupts, friendship is more important than power, or nature fights back. You can also have several different themes for different story arcs of the game for the different players if you want. Then you have to set the expectations on how much control do players really have about their character. Because sometimes new players think they can really do everything within a role-playing game, then they come to the table and play, and then there are rules that restrict their freedom. And some players can really get frustrated over that. But also are there situations where the players have no control over, or that players cannot interrupt. If you want to do something like that, you really have to communicate that, and you shouldn't do that very often. The next major expectation you want to set is improvisation and preparation. When you improvise more, the game becomes smoother, but you may forget about the things that you just improvised. When you prepare more, you have to look the things up, but they are set in stone. And now you have to figure out where's the silver lining between preparation and improvisation, and do they want to take notes to help you with your improv and so on. One important thing to talk about is the general law of the world. Are there things that every character would know? Are there 2 suns in the sky? Are there 3 moons? What are the most important historical things that happened that everyone would know? The new players need to know, are there any limitations to the world or the region that they are going to play in? Are there any limitations to the species, folks, classes or paths your players can choose from? And which languages would make sense for your players to choose depending on the regions that they are going to play through? What is the society of your player characters like, and what is the local lore of the places they are coming from? Then your players also need to know, where does the campaign start? What is this place like? What is the society like? What can they find there, and how did they get there? Is there any common lore that they know about this place? Is there anything that they specifically know about this place because the character lives there for their entire life? The thing that especially veteran players want to know is, how does the campaign start? Is there anything that they can prepare for the start of the campaign? For instance, one player wants to play a bard and the campaign starts within a bar, so they want to prepare a song and anything, and they want to stay on the stage while the other characters are going to see them. You have to tell your players which house rules do you use, and maybe they want to bring some house rules to the table. Some of those house rules might be good and stick, and some of those might be bad and you discard them along along the game. Then you have to show your players your game style. Each game master has a different game style and your players need to know what yours is. Some game masters are more unforgiving, some game masters have more focus on combat or on role playing, so they need to know what exactly they can expect. Then you want to talk about how comedic or dramatic a game can be. When is it appropriate to tell a joke outside of character and when is it appropriate to tell one in character? When the player makes a joke within a dramatic scene, this could ruin the immersion of other characters and therefore you should know when it is appropriate. Then you want to know what combat is like. Do you like tactical combat with miniatures and a grid, or do you like theater of mind? How much roleplay do you want in your game? When is it okay to break character? How do players indicate if they are speaking in character or outside of character? And another important thing is, how do you handle rules? Do you have rules or rulings? What I mean by that is you have set rules and they cannot change and you always use them like this, or you have rulings that are more like guidelines. I do it like this: when I have a very important encounter, I want to use the rules as written so everyone knows what they can expect from this encounter. On the other hand, when I have a random encounter, I'm gonna use the rules as guidelines so the players can do things outside of the box so the combat becomes more memorable. Let's talk about the character, and we start with the character creation. What is allowed in your game and how do you want your players to make the characters? What do you await from their backstories? What are the gameplay limitations for your characters? Are there certain spells that they can't use? Are there certain classes or species that are excluded for them? How common are certain items and how can your players acquire them or achieve them? Then you want to talk about the progression. How do characters progress through the game? When the game has a leveling system, you usually have experience points or milestones, but when you don't have leveling systems, how do your players progress through that game? And also, for how long do you play, or when does the game end? How realistic should a character be and how deep, detailed or dramatic should the backstory be? Because when some players want a deep and dramatic backstory or game and you have one player that wants to play a goofy character, that can often lead to frustration. During the session 1 you should also help your players maybe finding the starts to creating a character, especially when you have a player that is inexperienced. So you should help them, give them ideas for the backstory, what things they can use. For instance, when you play D&D you have the personality traits which can help a lot creating a better backstory and so on. Let's talk about the table, and we start with alcohol, cigarettes, cannabis and anything you could imagine. Are they allowed on the table? You may want to set some limitations because when people get drunk they become dumb and you usually have a TPK at the end of this game. Then also, how often do you make pauses? Not only to smoke but also to order food, to go to the toilet or to eat. Then are phones allowed or banned from the table? I personally like my players to have some kind of electronic device with them because I make PDFs with all the rules for my players so they can look up the stuff during the session, but also in general when you play Dungeons & Dragons you may want them be able to just Google for the things that they need at this moment. But you have to figure out with whom you play, because some people are very easy distracted by their phones and therefore you may not want them to have the phones on the table. Then how much metagaming is allowed on your table? Can your players tell another player what they have to do on their turn? Sometimes it's annoying, sometimes it can help a new player to find out how the game works. Then in general, how do you deal with information that your players may have but the characters don't? Do you trust them, or are you scared that they are using the information and change their play style? Then what happens on the table when a player is missing? Do you still play, and when yes, what happens to the character? Are they there or are they just there in combat? Is it played by the game master? Is it played by another character or anything like that? The last things are the responsibilities. Are there certain things that cannot be shown within the game? Is there content that shouldn't be allowed? Or are there no-goes for some players? This could be sexual violence, blood, slavery or anything like that. Different people come from different spaces and have different key events in their life, and therefore you should talk about them, what they can endure and what not. There could be something on the line between goes and no-goes, so the soft boundaries that you can bring up in the game but should not too often. For instance, sexual content and romances, maybe between players or players and NPCs. In general, people call those things safe spaces, but I think it's in general about the things that break or ruin the game for the people. Those could be easy things, like things that are breaking the immersion of some players. That could be laser swords in a medieval fantasy setting, and yes, I have seen that. And other things like automatons basically robots that a lot of people don't enjoy in a medieval fantasy setting. But also the species. For instance, when you play Dungeons and Dragons, you have seen fish people, which are literally fish, and some people just don't like those high fantasy characters. In the worst case, one of the players has to find another session, another playing group they can play with. And that begs the question, what are the consequences? What happens when someone breaks the rules? I guess most of you are friends and therefore this is not a big deal, but when you play with strangers, different people have different ideas about how this should go and so on. Most of those rule breakings aren't that bad, and therefore you can just talk to the player and they usually know that they have done something wrong before you even talk to them. But in other situations, there are some people, they just start to smoke in the living room of some person. Maybe in such a case you may even want to kick the player out of the game. I have made a Word document that you can download. This is a checklist where you can find all the things that I have talked about today just to make your session 0 easier. Thank you for watching. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. When you've liked what you've seen, please share, like, subscribe, and we see us in the next one.